Hello, I wanted to base this video on the basic builds, skills and equipment needed to participate in large-scale PvP effectively. I would stress from the beginning that I'm not a theory crafter. There are plenty of resources out there that are more useful than I would be in terms of developing very specific and advanced builds. However, I wanted to give some guidance on some basic things that all PvPers, regardless of skill levels, should try and do in order to participate in the game effectively. The video will be split into three sections, one focusing on equipment, one focusing on basic build advice, and one focusing on basic skills advice. I will not be going into things like champion points and other elements like that. As I say, that's not where my area of expertise is, and there are plenty of resources out there should you want to research further. I'll start by focusing on the equipment that I use during a play session, and more specifically the equipment I use in my quick slots. I will start by focusing on the most important item in your quick slot, which is your potion of immovability. I cannot stress the importance of using this potion enough, as it is your "Oh sugar plums, I'm about to die" potion, which can mean that if you're in a situation where you are taking heavy damage, you're rooted and everything's going wrong, you can use this potion to immediately remove those roots, gain some health, gain some magic or stamina depending on which type of build you are, and get out of the situation where otherwise you would die. I cannot emphasize how many times this has saved me, and it is critical that anyone that wants to play PvP effectively should be using this potion. It consists of three elements, the first being a knockback and immovability effect, which is where it gets its name, a heal effect, and then either restore magicka or stamina, depending on whether you're a magicka or stamina build. That's not to say this is the only potion you would use. So some specific builds will also use other specific potions. However, I cannot emphasize enough that everyone should be using this potion at least as a backup. The next slot for me is my food. If you needed more slots than you had available, would be an easy one to remove, because you could just use your food from your inventory whenever it runs out. However, I find I have the spare space for it, so I leave it on my quick slot. However, like I say, if you need the quick slot for other things, feel free to remove this for something else. The next two slots are dedicated to repair kits, one for woodwork, which is used to repair doors, and one for masonry, which is used to repair walls. During group PvP, it is important that you can quickly repair a kit that you have taken, so it is important that you slot plenty of these, and by having them in the quick slots, it means that you'll have access to them even if you try and repair a door or wall while still in combat. The next two slots should be dedicated to two pieces of siege. One of these pieces of siege should be to destroy walls with, or doors, which I use a standard Covenant Ballista, which obviously if you're playing for a different alliance would either be a Aldemir Domini Ballista or an Urban Park Ballista. These do more damage to walls and doors than fire blisters do, so therefore you should be using them rather than a fire blister. However, you could also use a stone trebuchet, which is also quite effective in the situation, and there are other options outside of that. As you can see, I personally run a lot of these within my standard run, because during a long fight, especially if you go from one keep to another without refreshing your amount of siege, you can soon go through these, especially if heavily counter siege, meaning that your sieges are taking a lot of damage from enemy counter siege. So you should run a lot of these, not necessarily as many as I do, but you should, I recommend, at least have 10. The next slot goes to a siege to be used for attacking enemy players. The most commonly used two types of siege for this are the meatbag catapult or the scattershot trebuchet. This is because these are the most effective at dealing damage to players. These are most often used defensively when you are trying to defend a keep, especially if the enemy group were trying to come through the door or one specific wall, as you can coordinate your attacks with other members of the group to put very heavy damage within that area whilst the enemy group was trying to come through. I generally don't run as many of these as I do with the blisters, because you will use them less often, but it's still worth having some, because siege damage is really unappreciated during open field fights especially, and It can do a lot of damage without people noticing if you are quick in setting it up before the fight starts properly. The next slot I personally use for oil defensive siege. This slot I recommend would be used for another type of siege, however it could either be oil or a ram, depending on whether you're expecting to do more attacking or defending of keeps. However, bear in mind that you don't need many rams per group, as you will only ever be using one ram, so I would recommend maybe if 1 in 8 people have ram slotted and everyone else would have another piece of siege. Both are highly effective during during keep combats, however not much use outside of that. The final quick slot is for camps. This is another very important thing to have in your inventory, because it can really turn the way a fight goes. Because if your group was to wipe but you are able to respawn at a forward camp, you may catch the enemy group by surprise and take the victory where otherwise it would have been a loss. You should have a decent number of these. I know that they're expensive to buy, but if you're playing in a decent guild group, you should be getting plenty of AP to cover the cost of these. So you should run, I would say, at least 4 in your inventory, so that if you do have prolonged fights which involve multiple stages of a fight, you will be able to drop a camp at each stage. So that covers all the items that I have in my quick slots. However, there are a couple of other items I'd just like to call out quickly because they are also of some importance. The first is the Bridge and Mile Gate Repair Kit. This is used to repair, as you would expect, bridges and mile gates, i.e. the ones outside Chalman, Alessia and Ash, for example. There are others on the map, but they're the 3 that are most commonly destroyed. Without these, you won't be able to repair these gates, which would make it impassable to go through them from one side, although if you're on the defensive side you can still get through using the stairs. It won't come up very often that you'll need to use these, however it's worth having some in the inventory just in case the situation comes up. The other one, and it may seem obvious, but it's worth bearing in mind, is soul gems. You need soul gems to res people, and sometimes you can forget to put these in your inventory just because they're not as critical as other stuff, and then be really annoyed when you go to res someone and realise you've not got any in your inventory. So just remember to have some in your inventory. They're not that expensive to pick up. If you've been playing for a while, you'll have more than you're ever going to need, but just remember to have them. Next, I'll briefly touch on gear. I'm not going to spend much time on this at all because I don't know that much about it myself. As I say, I'm not a theory crafter. However, there are a couple of very basic things I would just like to call out to make sure you understand. The first is that in PvP, generally it is accepted that for your armour you should be using the impenetrable trait to improve your critical resistance. This is because a lot of the damage you'll be taking is crit damage, and that is the damage that's harder to heal through, because the burst will come and you take a lot of damage within a few seconds, which most HOTS will not be able to keep up with. So unless you're running a specific build that tells you otherwise, I would suggest that you run impenetrable as your trait. The second thing is for your jewellery. I'm not personally running it, but to recommend that a few people within any guild group run the Harmony trait. Harmony allows you to use synergies more effectively, which can help deal large spikes of DPS during ultimates use. Most specifically when using Novas, if someone can drop a high damage Nova and then someone else with Harmony jewellery can activate the synergy of that Nova, that can do a lot of damage and will eliminate many enemies, especially those with less effective builds. I'll now talk a little bit about skills, and again I'd re-emphasise that there may be specific builds that tell you to use very specific skills. However, I would just have a couple of recommendations of skills that every PvPer should consider. So the first, and what I'd say is the most critical, is that you run either proximity detonation if you're a magicka build, or vigour if you are a stamina build. Obviously you'd have the vigour morphed to whichever vigour you prefer. Most guilds would recommend that there is a split between the 2 vigours, so that you have both HOTS going at the same time. Some guilds even run one person with unmorphed vigour to get all 3 HOTS going at the same time. However, it's just important you run the skill in the first place. For the proximity detonation, you should be using the proximity detonation morph because it is far more effective than the other morph, which requires you to target an individual player with. In the heat of battle, you're unlikely to have a enemy player who's nice enough to stand around for long enough for you to activate it, so proximity detonation is far more effective, especially because you can activate it before a fight and it will go off a few seconds later, hopefully when you're engaged with the enemy, and it's a bit of free DPS that every Magicka build should be using, even if you are a healer. I personally also recommend each player uses at least one other skill which is dedicated towards group effectiveness rather than individual DPS or healing. The main options I would suggest here are, if you are a stamina build, the rapid skill, which helps the mobility of your group. Again, there are two morphs here. There's debate as to which one's better. I personally use the retreating maneuver, but just like Vigor, it's often effective to have both morphs within the group. But for Magicka players, a recommended second skill would be Siege Shield. When you are attacking a keep, if you do not have siege shields and the keep is being defended at least somewhat effectively, you will likely lose a lot of people to enemy counter siege unless you have siege shields. So it is recommended a few people within the group, Magicka builds more often than not because they can refresh it more often due to the Magicka cost, will be running this skill. An alternative Alliance War skill for Magicka players is the Purge skill, which removes negative debuffs from the group. This can, even with the efficient Purge morph, this can be quite draining on the player's Magicka pool, so often groups will have one or two dedicated Purgers who focus on Magicka regen so that they can more effectively repeatedly use this skill. However, there are a variety of class skills which I'd also put into the pot of contributing to the group effectiveness, such as Dragon Knight Molten Armaments, so feel free to explore whichever class skills you're using, but make sure you are contributing in some way. I would also recommend that every player uses some sort of self-heal at least on their back bar. This is because during the chaos of a PvP fight you may get split up from the rest of your group and therefore will be required to survive based on your own heals alone and not rely on the heals of the dedicated healers within the group. I'm a healer, so I have multiple healing skills on my bar, but if you're a Templar, you've got Breath of Life. If you're any sort of stamina build, you've got Vigor, of course, and there are also other healing skills. But I would recommend it, at least on the back bar, if you're a DPS, to have some sort of self-heal. So that's it, that's the basics covered from my perspective and my experience. This is a topic that could be some debate, so feel free to provide feedback within the comments if you agree, disagree, or have further comments on anything that I've said. But I hope, as always, that it's been useful for anyone that's learning the basics of PvP, and if you have any feedback, let me know.